her next-door neighbour had disappeared. This being a Friday too, all that must have happened 3 weeks ago to the day. Since then, nothing more than a nod when Miss Lane looked in as she passed the house and saw her neighbour looking out at her. There was something quick in the woman's movements that would have caught even the most practised of curtain twitchers. Emily had reflected uncomfortably as she watched the figure walking down into the town once more. Now, early on this brilliant August morning, the latest in a long succession of them, she could see the woman at her own front gate, stretching herself very thoroughly before going for a jog, though Emily fancied from what she had seen of this before that a run was a more appropriate term. A black singlet that she could get away with because of her tiny bust, dark blue tracksuit bottoms, and professional-looking white trainers that were most certainly not from the discount store at Trago Mills. She pays a lot of attention to her legs, the hamstrings and things, but it wasn't Emily Willows' imagination. Miss Lane always spends more time working on her left leg than her right. And that makes sense, she thought, nodding to herself, because I have seen her limp once or twice. Nothing very noticeable, and not all the time, but she does for a few steps now and then. And just before she runs, she springs up like that on the balls of her feet, bounces a few times, opens the gate and turns left onto the footpath that takes one up along the steep slope that forms the eastern side of the tiny harbour. Steep it might be, but she never walks that first section. The woman runs up it, leaning into the hill, hunching her shoulders, and punching those muscly arms as if she enjoys the pain, or as if she has in front of her some invisible adversary. Emily Willows looked down at her own steadily spreading middle, and wondered how far she would get up the hill if she tried to run. She had been fit as a girl, and enjoyed school games, but even then she was more of a thrower than a runner. Miss Lane had a good 20 years on her too, and that makes a big difference, doesn't it? Nevertheless, she ought to do something, with her blood pressure seeming to inch up a little each time Dr. Scott managed to detain her in the surgery long enough to measure it. Get one of those DVDs and do a Zumba or something, or start going for proper long walks, instead of her customary 10 minutes up to the top of the rise and a sit on the seat that overlooks the beetling cliffs and the beautifully crinkled blue-green sea beyond. Robert was coming soon, and so there was a point to the morning, which made a nice change. He was bringing a card for her birthday tomorrow because he was on duty all day then, and in the middle of a big case that had had his attention for months, it seemed. As she tidied the kitchen and prepared the coffee machine, she found her thoughts wandering back once more to her neighbour. How far does she run? Sometimes she's gone for an hour or more. Fit people can probably run at 8 or 10 miles an hour if a steady walking pace is 3. Does she really run that far back towards Plymouth? No wonder there isn't an ounce of fat on her. And then Emily Willows had one of those moments that her husband Ron, when he was alive, used to marvel at. He'd say, "Think yourself lucky you weren't born 300 years ago because they'd have drowned you as a witch." She thought to herself, I wonder what she's running away from. When the whole of the house had been tidied and all of the downstairs had been hoovered, there was still no sign of her son, and so she went out into the garden. These houses were built in the days when land was cheaper, even in the steep and hidden coves of Cornwall, and her garden was a generous one, and private too. It was overlooked only at the far end by the upstairs of Miss Lane's property, which was further up the hill. Their gardens were separated first by a high traditional wall of local stone, and then by a substantial wooden fence, now much overgrown with climbing roses, clematis, and jasmine. But where the stone met the wood, there had once been a gate. To be more precise, there still was a gate, but it had not been opened in many a year. Previously, Ling Cottage had belonged to a standoffish couple who had used it only a few weeks each summer, a glorified holiday home, and Emily had never got to know them either. Any opening of the gate, for the bolt was on her own side, would certainly have been viewed as an intrusion. She stood by it now, and realized that even if the rusted bolt gave way, a particularly vigorous rambling red rose had effectively sealed up the entrance and any prospect of warmer relations with her neighbour. She crossed the lawn that sloped up towards the end of her garden, and looked back at the roof and upper windows of next door, still annoyed that she had not bought it in May when she had the chance. It would have suited her, being a little smaller with just 2 bedrooms, and the views of the bay were better.